I have a question about system design that you used in your projects. I want to ask you that how we can testify a research-oriented project that we use system design to figure out relations between independent parameter on that. How we can testify it.
How is it justified?
Testified. You said that we can calculating it and accounting it, but it's just a research-oriented project. That how we can testify it.
In the second example I was showing, or in the first?
No, it's just a general question.
Well, generally it's by setting performance targets, and then you see whether you can actually reach those performance targets. And obviously, once the building, you can check that. The more the city would be built, you can really see how it performs in reality. Before that, you have to rely on calculations or assumptions.
If we don't have any design projects after our research project, it's just a research-oriented project, and we don't continue it after that.
No, but you always have data that even if you research it, you can make it. You can make assumptions on how things would perform. That's why, for instance, we looked at the energy supply and demand. In general, that's an old building, so generally looking at tables, that's how much energy they would lose. And you know that by applying this or that technology, you can actually improve that by factor X. So that's because those are best practice or standards. That by exchanging the windows, you can easily, within a certain range of investment, you can improve the performance of a facade by X%. These are things that the energy planners would know.
So you think that we need some case studies before that? You suggest some case studies for that? Having some case studies prior to our systems?
Well, I think that's what's always happening in technical planning. Yeah, you look at the values, you look at how you can improve it, and then in reality you just.
If it don't be a technical program, it will be, for example, social aspects of...
Social aspects is obviously more difficult because the social indicators are very, very difficult to set up. So you have much more unclear assumptions. You can work with comparisons to other projects. You can say, here, this worked, this didn't work. I mean, social indicators are hell to get in. But it also, there are these things, and they're being researched. So, you can also look at. I mean, you have indicators like health. All the national statistics, they provide you things, and you know a bit by what strategy you can influence them in which direction. But obviously, if you haven't done it, like if it's just a project at project stage, the means of testing are obviously a bit more speculative than once it has been built. That's clear. So yeah, society, things might evolve differently than you assume.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Please sit down and we'll have a discussion. We can take a question there.
Thanks. It's pretty easy to adjust to a steady curve over a period of time. One could argue that one of the big problems with the current crisis of capitalism is that you don't have a steady curve. You can have an explosive rate change in economic growth or stagnation in short periods of time. Now, I think you have a very useful tool, this double axis of growth, stagnation, density, and more sparse areas. How do you see the interaction if you take into account the hard attack curve of economic growth and stagnation? How do you see the interaction over time when you will have periods where you advance towards technopolis and some periods where you advance towards Swiss Franconia, for instance? How do you, in space, in an area take this into account?
The question is how I could project that with certainty. I can't.
No, I mean the fluctuation between different quadrants, so to speak, as I understood it, right?
I think we were not trying to do that, and it's very difficult to do this. Yeah, I mean, you need economic advisors, you need really, really strong prediction, and it's very, it's very difficult to predict how things will develop. Of course, if you would do a super long research, you can look at the regional scale, et cetera, there's more or less reliable development prospects. You also always look a bit at, mostly cities look at how things have developed in the past. So they always tend to look back, yeah? It's very rare that you employ scenario planning as something that gives you reliable predictions for the future. And it's also not the idea. The idea is not to tell you, well, it's going to happen exactly like this. The idea is just to tell you, are we actually really sure that we know that we're going to grow? Because raising that question to a developer who would say, yeah, it will, sometimes, or maybe a developer who said it won't, because they don't go there and they all invest into places they seem as, risk-free, and the city still needs to somehow act. The city still needs to act within all these quadrants, but they tend to, planning tends to think that growth will happen. And I think it has over the past 50 years, 100 years probably. And I think the big question we now have in front of us with, the climate change, risks, disasters, economic decline, is that we have the feeling it's not going to last for much, much longer, yeah? So most of the people just, looking back doesn't really give you much clues about what could be. So I think that's really the point of the scenario planning, is just trying to open your imagination to something which could be different and still defining the tools that would actually hold up in each of them. And the idea is not that you really say, this is precisely the predicted path, because I think, well, I wouldn't be able to do it anyway. I think few people are.
I want to add something, because I think this is one of the key questions for the whole seminar for the last few days. Because the question of growth has sort of come up a few times, and in some of the presentations from officials here, it was really presented as a really key element for the future of Stockholm, that this sort of trust in growth and dependency on it, how the city is going to develop, is really kind of setting a kind of frame for the strategies for the urban development of the city, and this kind of belief in the sort of almost perpetual growth in next coming years for 2030, 2050, and so on. So I think this is a really important thing to question, also in perspective to what we've seen today. Before you presented, we had presentations by Trafikverket, talked about building a new highway and tunnels, the direction of how the city is going to develop there. Then we had Göran Kasch talking about certain examples where he mentioned that there was a case of Lund where planners were really thinking sustainably. We're going to follow all the known parameters of what sustainability is, but in the end it didn't work because people still went with cars to shopping centers. So that's also that question. Is like you were talking about maybe altering human behavior, the question of growth. It seems to be that there are several patterns sort of working together with each other, but also that there is a kind of question of fate that we all sort of rely on in planning.
Yeah. I think the key question is probably about values, and that's why I think infrastructure is one of the key things that gives current cities value, and that's for Stockholm it's certainly the case. You have very good schools, you have everything is kind of the building stock is fantastic, so people would invest because there's already existing value. And they would probably continue to invest because it seems to be, the investment seems to be securer than in other places, like, that could be just swamped, washed over by some floods. And you probably would currently still invest into securing the stuff you have, if it's needed, if you were, at risk of floods or other severe threats to your infrastructure values, you would probably invest into that first, so that the faith or the trust will be maintained. But I think, in terms of values, there's, let's say, if the monetary value would somehow decline, there's other things we would value, or that would come to the forefront, which I think, is the human development, is the happiness of people with their place, is whether the neighborhoods work well or not, whether people like living somewhere or not, or whether they kill or stab each other. I mean, those then become very important aspects to also maintain the faith of people in their place. So I think the growth, well, there's economic growth, but then there's also just the growth of, or the maintenance of what people value in a place. And that can be also maybe slightly more, well, if the economic values kind of decline, there's still something else that people can, like quality of life, that people can value. And I think it's important that cities know to stabilize these these values, irrespectively of what's going to come.
Yes. I also want to hear, of course, Helmut's comment here. Also, we can benefit from you being here this first part of the afternoon and hear your comment on those things. I would just add another thing that I've been thinking about, like during these days, is coming back to this notion of being reactive or being proactive in what you're doing, and trying to maybe thinking also back when you study something historically. You could see the metro line of Stockholm, for instance, was really a proactive thing where no one really knew what was going to happen. It was a huge investment, and it has turned out to be, in many respects, a very good investment.
Well, I think looking on Stockholm, it's a very unique situation here that, let's say, the city itself owns a lot of the property. Because typically, if you have these big movements of people, there are, I think, hundreds of examples all around the world, you end up in speculation. So let's say the costs go up through the roof. Casablanca, for example, there are a couple of North African cities which really experience that right now. And we have, I think here, the specific situation that the city itself is more or less doing this investment. I'm really doubting these figures because I think these movements are related very strongly to economic issues, and we don't have really a stable economic situation now. So I think nobody can predict, nobody has this crystal ball telling us exactly what might be the situation in 5 or 10 years. And I think that's the big dilemma, because looking on the timelines for, let's say, investments here, doing constructions here, you have to restart more or less now if you want to have some impact in 5, 6, 7, 8 years. But it's a kind of gambling. And that's it, more or less.
Do we have any questions from the audience?
I have a short question to both of you, because you both talked about integrated planning as really a key factor for good planning. Which members would be the dream team would have if you can decide, for example, architects, urban planners, landscape architects, biologists, engineers? Which one do you want to have in a boat for like the dream team?
Well, the minimum, I think that there's a minimum scope, which is obviously, landscape, water, energy, transport, all the key technical infrastructure, standard infrastructure experts. I think, and you can't do a master plan without that, basically. Definitely on a master planning team, an economic advisor would be very good. Some social, social advisor as well that would try to also bring local people into play. But I think it's maybe not so much about only the people on board, but the questions you ask them. You know, because a transport planner also has a clue about economics from his point of view, and a transport planner also has a view on social issues. So maybe, I'm thinking as I speak, maybe it's really about the process also of the master planning and how you question why you would master plan and why you would set up certain targets and goals. That is just as important as, you know, the number of people you have around the table, because the more people you have around the table, the more difficult it also gets. So I think tools like, for instance, the scenario planning, as, you know, workshops that could happen with the client, certain representatives that know the site very well, are probably just as powerful as, you know, a huge crowd of people. And yeah, and slightly, there is a way in managing the process how you can really increase the creativity of the outcomes. Like, you can either do it the business as usual case, and everybody does what they have learned in school, and, you know, what is secure and what, you know, costs them very little to in time, and, you know, they can go home at 4 o'clock or 5, and they have delivered their stuff, so it's within the scope. But there's ways you can actually slightly expand on the scope, and that depends very much on a good team spirit. And you can, if you have a good project manager that sets up the right workshops at the right time, somehow this, you know, extra plus would happen between, you know, people exchanging their ideas and really going a bit out of their way, and that's also terribly valuable for, I think, good master planning.
Thank you. It was funny, we had a similar discussion at the lunch break, and my quite short answer was that, to my experience, as soon as the people have a certain level of skills, a certain level of experience, that they are open-minded enough to, even if they are critical or conservative or contradictory, but if they are experienced enough to leave the main path, to rethink what they did in the last, whatever, decades, and are brave enough even to admit maybe that there are better or other ways to approach something. And especially in these tense discussions, I made experience that if you have to re-question yourself, your approach, rethink in all direction, that's the best environment to develop good solutions.
Yeah, I wanted to add something since you mentioned the lunch break. It was a good moment to talk with everybody a little personally and honestly. So we talked about, I actually talked with a guy from Trafikverket, and I'm a huge opposition to this highway being built, but what I was asking him really, what is the idea about privatization in the city, because we noticed that there's quite a lot of, you mentioned that there's quite a lot of Stockholm still in the public hands, but this is not necessarily going to be like that in the future. So there are processes currently going on which are making it more difficult to plan the city, and there are multiple forces that are multiplying, and there are many vested interests, a lot of them economic interests, maybe singular in their purpose and so on. So we started discussing why is this happening, and his answer was that this is because these market forces, they're going to eventually balance somehow. And then I replied to him that, well, this is basically coming from the politicians who have already kind of accepted the non-proven dogma. There's no scientific proof that the markets balance in a perfect way. And this is seen in a sort of economic crisis that we have, and you just mentioned this kind of instability, roller coaster of going down. So it's also quite ironic that the presentation of Trafikverket started with politician talking about the value and importance in sort of video in a very kind of, I would say, structured presentation that basically very sort of innocently kind of told the story of how they think, how they work, what the process is, without us having to be very cynical about it. So and then, you know, it was really interesting. I mean, he was looking at me, he's like, yeah, you're right. You know, maybe there shouldn't be so much privatization. I also think that there is a positive possibility of having kind of open discussion and dialogue with people who have their niche and they work, let's say, with engineering and they're developing a city. But perhaps the influence of the politics is really so strong in that sense, that there is a kind of certain agenda, and that's accepted dogma of how we believe that cities of today should develop. Does anybody want to continue on that? Relational market economics and development of cities.
It could be maybe interesting also to hear your kind of if you had some concrete comments on the bypass. Did you? I'm thinking about Helmut. If you did any, because it's a huge issue, of course, here in Stockholm at this point.
It's a little bit tough. But only as an example, we had a similar discussion in my hometown, and there's a big infrastructure project. It started in '75. It's a relocation of a central station, and it ended up that the government was changed for this region. So now we have the first green government all over Germany, and for this fairly conservative area where I'm living, that's really a kind of earthquake. And I think the main reason was not the project itself, but it was the non-involving, non-letting the people participate in the decision, or at least they had the impression nobody is respecting them, and that drove them crazy. And I think, especially now in these days, these kind of projects seems to be a little bit like a dinosaur out of a different time. That's my perspective.
Yeah, for sure.
I have a question for Corina, because we worked not on the Tongtan project, but we worked on Chongming Island with Tongji University 2 years ago, for 2 years in a row. What happened with Dongtan in the end?
It's the mayor who was the strongest supporter of Dongtan was jailed. That's it. For corruption. And you don't quite know, why he was jailed, whether the central government or him was corrupt. But that was basically it. It was political reasons.
Because this is an interesting case. When we went with the studio, urban design studio, we worked there for 2 years. We were looking at the whole island, and it's in Shanghai. It's an agricultural area. It's very close to Shanghai. It's a source of fresh water and also a source of really good food there. And they are urbanizing it. So we heard about Dongtan, this really perfect, sustainable city. And then when we went there and spent time there, then we discovered there is no Dongtan. There is few recycling plants and water recycling and also sewage recycling plants. But the place is at one level dominated by agriculture, but then also it has really intense urban developed areas with skyscrapers even. And if one looks back in time, then we investigated maps of how Shanghai developed, and you could see that Pudong, which is now full of skyscrapers, now it's basically a center of Shanghai, was maybe 20 years ago exactly the same like Chongming Island. It was just this sort of agricultural land, and maybe some kind of change in the agenda made it skyscrapers. So I thought that I wanted to know about really what's the story behind in the end with Dongtan. Yeah, you can tell it's a.
Nobody really knows.
But it kind of. But it's interesting to see that's the totally different political system, of course. And here we have another political system. We've been talking about this thing with the municipal planning monopoly that we have and so on. It results in this, where the effect here, one of the effects is that all the experts agree on, for instance, that this bypass is a bad idea. But nevertheless, the politicians will go through with the idea.
Well, it also makes that initially it's easier to build an eco-town, with one client somewhere in the desert, yeah, than to refurbish an existing city. Like, why would you ever do that? Deal with like millions of landowners who want to then, kind of get up like in Stuttgart, and they want to be, I don't know, get money for leaving their places. Or I mean, it's just the more people you have involved, the more difficult it obviously gets. The system. That's why you have to involve them early.
This is maybe not a question of architecture, or planning. But last year I was thinking a lot about democracy and its faults, like that it's so short-sighted somehow, and it's very hard in a crisis like we have today to make changes that are long-sighted. And yeah, just some thoughts about how does that affect us planners to deal with the short-term democratic system that we have today. Yeah.
Well, I think it depends really on the agent, who has the agency in a country. Like, if the agency is with, we had also, some of our master plans or the biggest cities, they were developed, 200 years ago, and there was no problem over the long term at all, because the normal people they weren't the ones that were building the value. They weren't the ones that had to innovate, etc., etc. There weren't democracies. The agency was with the king, as it is now, in Master in a totally different structure, as it is in China still. That's, that you can get through these things in very different ways, and some of these things might be sustainable on the very long term in certain social contexts, but in others they just aren't, and that's part of the system, simply. I don't really know the answer to your question, but you basically need to look at who's empowered, and who do you want to be empowered.
Can I help? I think there is a little bit of a problem in the kind of way the question is formulated, but I know what you mean. I think that it's not a problem with democracy, because democracy doesn't exist without people acting. So it's a complete process all the time of having to act and react and being educated. So I think democracy is an opportunity for people to make it really a democracy. It's not a given sort of poster sign that says we are not democracy, we are making democracy. That's how I see it. So especially in urban processes, and you also talked about bottom-up. I mean, these are the kind of forces where there is an opportunity to create democracy through action, through discussions. Today, I think, is a kind of an act of democracy. And this Stockholm on the Move perhaps is an opportunity to become kind of influential moment in the future of Stockholm. And that could become a kind of act of democracy, the way I see it. I don't know.
Yes, but at the same time, it's the politicians that makes the final decisions, and they are elected. So, and in the end, it's like about winning the elections. And that is still like, the way I see it, is not something that is increasing, it's decreasing. Like the way people are active and really understand the decisions the politicians make, it's kind of moving in a populistic direction. And can you, as a planner, but that's what I guess you answered. It's our job as planners to maybe make it easier for people to understand the right decisions for the politicians.
I mean, I don't have the answer either, but I think it's really interesting then that we are building roads in Stockholm or infrastructure projects today that actually were planned in the 50s and 60s. So there's the same plans going on. That's really long-term perspective, and it's in a democracy, and we're doing it kind of, it's not, even though we have a kind of democracy, it's not kind of doing it the kind of scientific way either. So, it's not, I mean, And on the other hand, we have this, like the critique that we talked so much about yesterday about participation being hijacked, right, by some kind of liberal economy. That kind of, yeah, I don't know if you have.
Only as a little remark. So 2 weeks ago, I had a kickoff for a little development on a neighborhood in Stuttgart. And the second sentence at the introduction from the guy from the administration from the city, he said, oh, we have to consider participation quite a bit. We don't want to experience, once again, the same situation as with the central station. So the politicians are really scared because you have to be aware, we had the same party running the administration for 50 years. They started after the war and was always the same party. And only due to this project, they got kicked out, and I think they got kicked out for the next 10 or 20 years. And now the politicians want to make this experience once again. So they put pressure on the administration. And now, if we do this kind of participation process, or if we don't, but the people are concerned. They want to follow up, let's say, or at least pick up the meaning of the people involved in that thing. And I think this reaction is the best what could happen, because I think that's democracy, that the people are having an impact on the development of their environment. They have to live there, they have to take care of it, so they should be driving the decisions. And now they forced it, and they seem to be successful.
It's almost like
We're wrapping this up.
Yeah,
Just the final comment, please.
it seems like I think really architects need to be much more conscious about who they're building for and who their clients and who their business cases actually are, because many of the current business cases are still or they are for maybe the clients of yesterday. And I don't know whether with the economic prospects we have, I'm not sure. It could be that the business case becomes a very different one in the future. And so maybe we have to really look at, who's at the core of what we want to do, and maybe, it's the people, and then your project will look very different. And maybe, it goes more, if the people are the ones that make the change, because they're ones that, can take decisions, or I don't know, the ones that make the changes to their buildings, because, that's the only way how you can actually get to those buildings, then design for them. And maybe it's just much smaller interventions and much smaller opportunities. But it's I think, very important to know where the opportunities for transformation are. And they're not necessarily, I believe, anymore only with the big actors.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It was a good way to wrap up, I think, really. I mean, for us, I think, Bojan, one of the things with this course where we kind of study this huge, vast area of information that we could never grasp even in a lifetime, almost. One of the things is that we really want to question how we, as architects or planners, are acting and trying to say something about fields that maybe are not always considered the core thing of our profession, but the importance of being an actor in that field.
And thanks for staying and enduring through the really, really intense week. And I hope you guys enjoyed and learned something from this, and that you're going to be able to produce something next week, which is inspiring and challenging, and we can raise questions about Stockholm. And we'll see you on Monday in the morning at KTH. And thanks for all the other guests who have been here. I don't know if there is anybody outside of KTH here still, but thanks.